So I like to keep to a schedule, but I also like when there are things that come up in current events. I do think one of the benefits of the live lecture format is that we can incorporate those things in real time. That I was told one time, and I still don't know how much of an urban legend this is, but I was told that I think it was Milton Friedman would come into his Principles of Economics class with the newspaper and just be like flipping through the newspaper, find something economically interesting, and then just talk about it for the class. And that may not have covered all of the topics in a principles course in a particularly organized fashion, but would be really, really interesting to watch, right? So ideally, I would say you do sort of a combination of those two types of approaches. So I try to bring in things that we see in the news that are somewhat relevant to the course, even when they don't perfectly fit in with what we're talking about today. And so, like I said a couple minutes ago, the story that is going around the internet today, we have the most hated man on the internet, who apparently is an ex-hedge fund guy that bought up a pharmaceutical patent for, I guess, the medicine that prevents you from being a crazy cat lady, if I'm remembering correctly, and jacking up the price, like literally overnight. So, hey, I own this now, rather than having a price of, what they say here, $13.50, we're going to price this thing at $750. And, you can think back to your Econ 101, the thing about patents is that you then have a monopoly on your product, so you don't have this, typical supply and demand relationship. You have some sort of profit maximization happening with marginal revenue and marginal cost. Given that this thing, prevents you from some combination of dying and becoming a crazy cat lady, we talk about fairly inelastic demand for things that are seen as necessities. Obviously, this would likely fall into that category. It's not entirely surprising if you were literally to do some sort of marginal revenue, marginal cost analysis, you would get a high price out of that. Mm-hmm.
Who bought the company? Or who, isn't it Turing?
Yeah. And I only remember that because I remember just the mnemonic because I think of like Alan Turing so that is definitely true. I don't remember the guy's name. I don't know that it's...
No, Turing is the name of the company.
Yeah, Turing's the name of the company. I can't remember the guy's name. So if you see the picture up in the left-hand, like upper left corner, he looks like Will Forte's evil sociopathic twin or something like that. The picture's further down in the article. I don't remember his name specifically. I just remember that he used to work for a hedge fund and then decided to get into whatever this is instead. And it's somewhat of an interesting story because if you think this through, we think about why do we see price changes in markets, and if we're going via a traditional economic model, just think supply and demand, right? That you would see an increase in price when you had an increase in demand or a decrease in supply, right? In this case, you wouldn't literally have a supply curve because of the monopoly situation, but you could say that decrease in supply would be interpreted as an increase in the cost of production. And in this case, you most likely had neither, right? You neither had, overnight way more people needing this thing than needed it before, nor is it likely that overnight, the cost of production skyrocketed. So our traditional economic models can't really explain why we would see this behavior. And it actually just mathematically has to be the case that either the old producer or the new producer were not profit maximizing, right? That it's unlikely that, by some freak of nature, both the $13.50 price and the $750 price were both profit maximizing, right? So then you have, obviously that leads us to a question of who's right and who's wrong. Is the guy charging the $750 making a mistake, or is the guy that was charging $13.50 making a mistake, right? In either case, we start seeing those things that we take for granted that, we have this assumption of profit maximization on the part of firms, right? We said those assumptions of rationality, consumers are long-term utility maximizing, producers are profit maximizing, and then in traditional economics, base all of our models off of that assumption and say, hey, this is what the world's going to look like. Obviously, if those assumptions are violated, we're not making accurate predictions about what the world is going to look like. And in a way, this is giving us another reason why it's important to understand not only how consumers are thinking, but how firms are thinking. Because if we want to accurately describe the world as it is, we need to understand the decisions that people are making. And most likely here, I obviously don't have the internal numbers, but what seems to be happening is that this new producer is going solely on this notion of profit maximization, whereas the earlier one was not. That the earlier person seemed to be taking into account some, non-pecuniary benefits of, fairness, being nice, social good, whatever. Right? And we're actually going to come back and talk about the effect of social norms and fairness considerations on markets and why that would be potentially important for producers to think about, even if they don't care about fairness themselves. Mm-hmm.
What do you think is like the reason for, in general, medicine in the United States and medical care costs more than, say, in the Netherlands? It's pretty cheap. Like, what do you think is the reason there?
I can come up with a better answer for why it costs a lot as opposed to why it specifically costs more, right? That when you have imperfect competition in a market, that's going to push prices up above marginal cost. That's one issue. Two, we don't have the end consumer being the payer, right? The fact that we have the medical insurance in the middle there that doesn't get a perfect say in what the consumer does. The consumer as the decision maker isn't necessarily caring how much they're costing the insurer. That we get some form of moral hazard happening because of the insurance structure. We also have a problem, and I again don't know how specific this is to the US, but we have a problem of transparency. That in order to actually save money to make efficient decisions for ourselves, we actually have to know how much things cost. And there have been a lot of examples where we can go in and ask, different hospitals for the same procedure, and they quote wildly different prices. But it was so hard in the first place to even find out what those prices are. It's not surprising that people aren't, even if they wanted to save their insurance company money, be making those decisions based on price. And I think at the very least those price transparency issues are more severe here than they are in other countries. And I think, you have a confluence of these different factors when you have, especially when you're comparing to, say, Canada, that has a single payer system. You have one entity that has an incentive to find out the prices and so on and so forth. That all of what we're seeing, I wouldn't say all, but the majority of what we're seeing comes down to those issues with market structure, where we're very, very far from this competitive market of well-informed consumers and competitive firms, right? And we seem to be further away from that in the US than we are in other countries in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm.
Like in a case like this, right? He bought the sole rights to the medicine, right?
Yeah.
So
which I don't understand, because the medicine's actually been around for a long time. So this is something interesting that I didn't have time to look into further. It says an overnight increase in the price of a 62-year-old drug. I don't know what patent lawyer you can get on this that's finding out a way to somehow extend this patent for 62 years when the standard life of a patent is, 17 years? Something like that. And so I don't know what shenanigans they even pulled for this to still be on patents in the first place. But yeah, the whole idea of being able to patent pharmaceuticals is that you have a monopoly on that compound for at least some theoretically limited period of time. So what you're seeing in this case, even though it seems a little bit weird given the time frame, given the length of time this has been going on, you're seeing monopoly pricing, right? So that's not something that is specific to the U.S. When pharmaceutical companies file patents, they file patents in I think almost 200 countries, so that they're protected basically everywhere that respects intellectual property law. So that's not necessarily different, nor is it necessarily bad. This seems to be somewhat of an abuse of the system on multiple levels. But the idea is that you have a high R&D cost industry. If we had a situation where competitors could immediately, go buy up a compound, reverse engineer that compound, compete with the original maker of that compound, the people doing that upfront R&D wouldn't necessarily then be able to recoup their investment. It wouldn't be profitable for them to engage in that upfront activity. So there are reasons that this patent system can make sense, but then also ways in which obviously it gets abused. One, two, creates a situation that is potentially harmful and not necessarily socially optimal from a consumer standpoint.
According to Google, I found this drug is for HIV. So
among other things, yeah.
Actually, as I know, some governments like to pay for it to give the patient this drug free. So if there is possibility that this company just increase the price because they have a contract with some government, so they can get lots of money, and because for the governments the people pay it, but for the whole bunch of people in the country, they may not feel that they really have more tax or something else.
Right, and this all comes back to the widely cited phrase in economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch, that in a lot of cases the consumer is not going to see this $750. Your example was that this is paid for by some governments as a public health concern. In some cases, this is going to hit the insurance companies more directly than the individuals. And if you read the articles about this, the main short-term concern was for people who either didn't have insurance or whose co-payments weren't a fixed amount. You can have an insurance plan where you get a prescription, that prescription's $20. Well, if you have that kind of plan, this is going to be $20 regardless. One would hope that your copay wasn't $20 and the thing cost $13.50, but you get the point. But there can also be insurance plans that are structured such that you pay, say, 20% of the cost, in which case those sorts of plans, the customer would be directly affected here. In any of those cases, it's important to keep in mind that even if the customer's not directly affected, they're indirectly affected. If the government's providing it, you're exactly right, that money's got to come from somewhere. People are going to indirectly be paying taxes to fund that. The insurance companies have to remain solvent, so even if they're, in a short-term sense or in an indirect sense, paying this and not directly immediately charging the consumer, obviously this is eventually going to be reflected in higher premiums and things like that, right? So from a specific behavioral economics standpoint, you think about why I'm talking to you about this, other than the fact that I find it generally interesting. What seems to be happening is that you had the old producer, the first producer here, wasn't actually profit maximizing. That there was some consideration other than pure profit maximization, whether it be fairness, whether it be, helping society, whatever. And you do see some of that, maybe not as much as people would like, but you do see some of that in the pharmaceutical industry, especially with companies who are developing compounds that are helping people in developing countries and stuff like that. So basically what we're seeing here is likely that you had, what I would consider, in behavioral economics we talk about humans versus econs, that we can talk about our Homo economicus and then we can talk about actual people. And it seems like here we have an actual human or an actual person being replaced by Homo economicus. So we seem to have found Homo economicus, he just turns out to kind of be a douche, right? And this gets back to this idea, remember I brought up the Freakonomics podcast before, do we actually want to live in a world of Homo economicus? And there are actually a lot of reasons why we might not actually want that. That Homo economicus doesn't seem like a particularly pro-social creature. And we should be careful of taking these assumptions of rationality as prescriptive or, interpreting them as how people should behave. Mm-hmm.
Do you think, like, things like patent rights and so on are contrary to, like, the free market? And what do you think would be, like, a solution, if any, to lowering the price here? Because I feel like the only way is to increase competition, but because we have these patent rights, isn't that contrary to, like, free market?
Yeah, because you're granting a monopoly. You're basically having a government-sponsored monopoly via intellectual property protection. So in a short term, in a direct sense, you are inhibiting competition. In a more global sense, however, like I said, if you were to let the free market do its thing in the pharmaceutical industry, you might end up in a situation where everyone's sitting around waiting to free ride off of somebody else's discovery. You might not actually get anything made. And so in that case, it becomes a trade-off, like which is the lesser of the evils, right? That you can't, because of the high upfront R&D costs, you can't necessarily have a competitive market functioning well in the long term because the incentives to innovate aren't necessarily there. And that's an open question, and it probably differs industry by industry to say what would happen if this incentive to innovate wasn't there in the pharmaceutical industry. That answer might be very different than, for example, I studied the music industry. You can say, well, what if we weaken copyright protection in the music industry? Are people going to stop making music? That answer in that industry might be very different. So the rationale is that we can never get to, a globally perfect solution. Which one of these is less bad? Would you rather have drugs being discovered and then at high prices because of monopoly, or would you want them not discovered in the first place?
I was going to say one thing that I think would be interesting to look into related to this would be like the healthcare system in a place like Singapore, which is known to have like an extreme...
Places where chewing gum is illegal, they just scare me.
Singapore's got its own government, I'm pretty sure. Eduardo Savin moved there. He's like one of the Facebook guys because they don't have any taxes or very low taxes. And one of the problem is, we all know, is that when you're on your deathbed, like, all right, well, I'll sell you this drug for $25. So like, that's too expensive. I won't pay $15. Like, you're not gonna make that decision. You probably value your own life more than the efficiency of the market in which you're operating. I know I do at least. So that leaves people like this guy sort of, I don't know, the liberty to do something like this, but I wonder if, like, even a place like Singapore, which is known to have extremely free economics for banks and for all these other things, if they have more regulation for something like, say, healthcare that wouldn't function to normal standards.
Yeah, this guy's not doing anything illegal. Let's be clear. That he's not being a nice guy necessarily, but yeah, he's not doing, he's not, as far as we know, at least at this point, doing anything illegal. And part of the reason that healthcare discussions are difficult is because we have this inherent notion that everyone is entitled to healthcare, that everyone is entitled to whatever technologies to keep them alive, right? And that's very different. We don't say, for example, everyone is entitled to an iPhone. So, hey, an iPhone's expensive, you can't afford it, you don't buy it, whatever. Who cares? That's a very different, just from an ethical standpoint, that's a very different question. And so we have this tension where we want to have, for the sake of efficiency, a market-based system, because we know that in a lot of cases that's efficient. It's not necessarily fair. But then we would also ideally like to have a system where nobody gets priced out. That becomes very difficult because we talk about rationing healthcare, and that's anathema to even say. But prices in and of themselves function, among other things, as rationing mechanisms. So we sort of get stuck in we want everything for free that doesn't come for free situation, and it's unclear how to how to satisfy people's needs as best as possible. So it's not surprising that this is a difficult situation where we can't just say, markets, you get prices out of it, some people pay, some people don't. That's a not socially acceptable outcome in a way that it is a socially acceptable outcome for things that aren't viewed as necessities.
What do you think the individual is trying to achieve though by making $750? Is he actually
Money.
expecting sales?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, he's gonna get the sales if for no other reason than the contracts between patients and the insurance companies are such that this is on the list of included pharmaceuticals, at least for now. So legally speaking, at least in the short term, the insurance companies are obligated to pay this. Yeah, that this is definitely driven by desire for return. There's speculation here that the guy that bought the patent is actually using the income from the patent to subsidize losses from his actual hedge fund business and to pay back to investors so that they don't get too upset. That's where it starts getting a little shady, right?
Yeah, it's too exploitative.
He's working the fact that it's an age drug. It's not like a criticality drug.
Yeah, I think it's I think it actually treats a number of different things because it's all autoimmune, right? So there are a number of different ways in which that could arise. But yes, one thing that it does because AIDS is an autoimmune disorder is help treat that. Yeah, that we have obviously financial considerations, but also fairness considerations, ethical considerations. These aren't things that the traditional economic models are well designed to say anything about, that they only know marginal cost and marginal revenue, right?
Is it possible that they're raising the price that high has longer term trade-offs, that he's just discounting more? Like maybe, that startup's, facing more liquidity constraints than a large pharmaceutical company, so he's really just trying to emphasize those short-term dividends.
So the argument that he's making is that by charging this higher price, he's making more money and can put that money into investing in R&D for better treatments using this drug. The problem is that doctors are then asked, and they're like, yeah, that's not a thing. Like, the treatment regimen here is fine. There's not really a hugely beneficial way to improve on that. And they're basically saying that this guy seems like he's full of crap. That they actually did ask doctors, does this seem like a reasonable thing? Because on the surface, it does seem like an argument and sort of the justification for the monopoly from patents in reverse, right? Rather than saying that the monopoly power is compensating for R&D that already happened, the monopoly power is enabling you to collect economic rents, which are then spent on future R&D. There might be something to that argument, but then they push that further and said, do you think that this is actually going to be value-enhancing R&D? And the doctors, by and large, were like, I don't think so. And it's also not going to be value-enhancing R&D if the money is instead, rather than actually going to R&D, going to give returns to its hedge fund clients. Mm-hmm.
I was gonna ask, so do you think, you said something about public health care? Is that, you're saying that's driving up costs for that kind of stuff, or?
What do you mean?
You mentioned something about public health care earlier, how it's driving up costs or something.
Well, I don't mean like public health care is like a single payer system. Anything where there's division between the decision maker and the ultimate payer is going to lead to some inefficiency. Because if you're only paying, if you're paying your $20 copay and you're paying $20, just take a very simple example. You're paying $20 regardless of where you go and get your prescription filled. You're going to go to the CVS like next to your building or whatever. You're not going to, unless you were a really, really, really societally minded individual, which, hey, I'm a behavioral economist. I'll acknowledge maybe these people exist. You're not going to trek across town to the Walgreens because the Walgreens is going to charge your insurance company less money, even though you're still paying $20, right? So you have a decision that would be efficient for the system, and the benefits of you trekking to Walgreens might outweigh, for the system overall, the cost of you trekking to Walgreens, but your personal cost-benefit calculations don't support that decision. And that's a very simple example of how you would get inefficiency in the system. And that is a form of moral hazard, right? Moral hazard is defined as the person choosing what actions to take, not bearing the full cost and benefits of his or her actions. Just like you have the person eating more than is efficient at the all-you-can-eat buffet because they're not paying for each individual shrimp, even though each individual shrimp costs the buffet money, you have a similar thing happening here. And that's going to happen regardless of whether it's a single payer from the government, whether it's an insurance company, etc., just because we don't have that direct, decision-making authority lined up with the incentives of the system. And I'm going to ask you to think about this. We are going to come back and talk about whether we can put a framework on what people consider to be fair and unfair in a marketplace, and whether people are willing to do anything about it to punish those that are viewed as being unfair. Okay? So you can keep thinking about this.